The execution chamber stood silent, save for the steady hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The air was thick, weighted with the gravity of what was about to unfold. Stephen Lawayne Nelson lay strapped to the gurney, his hands motionless, his breathing steady. Witnesses gathered behind the glass, each carrying their own version of justice, of closure, of retribution. Then came his final words. A voice, unshaken, unwavering. "I'm not scared. Let's ride, Warden." A single nod from the officer in charge. A signal. And then, the process began. What went through his mind in those last moments? Was it fear? Was it regret? Or was it something else entirely? For over a decade, he had sat on death row, waiting, knowing this day would come. Some say he had made peace with it. Others believe he died holding on to a truth no one wanted to hear. Tonight, we uncover the story in its entirety. The final confession. The letters left unread. The rejected plea for forgiveness. And the truth of what happened in his final hours. This is the last confession of Stephen Lawayne Nelson. To understand the final moments of Stephen Lawayne Nelson, we must go back to the day that sealed his fate. It was March 3, 2011. Arlington, Texas. Inside the walls of North Point Baptist Church, the sound of a struggle echoed through the halls. By the time the church secretary arrived, the scene before her was horrifying. Pastor Clint Dobson, a man devoted to his faith and community, lay lifeless on the floor of his office. Strangled. Beaten. His assistant, Judy Elliott, barely clung to life. The robbery had been swift, ruthless, and merciless. The investigation moved quickly. Witnesses placed Stephen Lawayne Nelson in the vicinity, and within days, he was arrested. The prosecution painted him as a man without conscience, a violent offender who had no regard for human life. The evidence was damning. Dobson's stolen car was found abandoned, Nelson's fingerprints were present, and items from the church were discovered in his possession. But Nelson's story was different. He claimed he was present, yes, but as a lookout. He insisted that he did not kill Dobson, that he was merely an accomplice to a crime that spiraled out of control. His defense argued that another man, an unnamed accomplice, had carried out the brutal murder. But in the eyes of the jury, it was too little, too late. Within a year, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For 13 years, Nelson sat on death row, his appeals denied one by one. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals upheld his conviction. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to intervene. The state remained firm, the sentence would be carried out. And on February 5, 2025, after more than a decade of legal battles, Stephen Lawayne Nelson was scheduled to die by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. The weight of his execution did not fall on him alone. Among those witnessing his final moments was Rev. Jeff Hood, a man who had spent years providing spiritual counsel to death row inmates. Hood had walked with Nelson through his last days, offering a presence of solace, of redemption, of faith, if Nelson was willing to accept it. As the clock counted down, there were no last-minute appeals. No legal interventions. No stays of execution. The state of Texas was ready. And so was Stephen Lawayne Nelson. Or at least, that's what he wanted the world to believe. In the hours leading up to his execution, he made a final request, to send a letter to the family of Clint Dobson. It was a letter of apology, of reflection, of remorse. A final plea for understanding, if not forgiveness. But the family refused to accept it. To them, there was no redemption, no closure in his words. Only the unchangeable truth, that Pastor Clint Dobson was gone, and the man responsible was about to meet his own fate. As the sun set over the Huntsville unit, the prison prepared for the inevitable. The gurney was readied. The 4 lines were set. The chamber doors stood open. And just beyond them, in a dimly lit holding cell, Stephen Lawayne Nelson waited. His fate was no longer in his hands. The hours of his life had dwindled to minutes. Soon, those minutes would become seconds. And then, nothing at all. But before the final act, there was one last confession. A truth he wanted the world to hear. And what he said in those moments would linger far beyond the walls of the execution chamber. Conflicting accounts of the crime had plagued this case from the beginning. Nelson swore he never laid a hand on Pastor Dobson, yet the prosecution built a case that left little room for doubt. The jury believed the forensic evidence, the testimonies, the circumstantial pieces that painted him as the killer. But was there more to the story? Conflicting narratives. Nelson maintained that he was nothing more than a lookout. Prosecutors argued he was the mastermind of the attack. Defense attorneys pointed out inconsistencies in witness statements and the lack of direct DNA evidence linking Nelson to the act of strangulation. And then there was the letter. A last attempt at redemption. A plea for peace. Nelson wanted the Dobson family to read his words, to hear his voice in written form, to know that he understood the depth of their loss. But the church stood firm. The letter was returned unopened. To them, there was no redemption to be had. Unresolved questions. Was Nelson the true killer, or was he covering for someone? How did his troubled past shape the choices that led him to this moment? Why were key details in the case left unexplored? As Nelson counted down his last moments, did he finally speak the truth? Or did Texas execute a man whose story was never fully heard? The weight of that answer would remain long after his heart stopped beating. Stephen Lawayne Nelson spent his final hours in a holding cell just steps away from the execution chamber. Those who saw him described him as calm, composed. Some even said he seemed indifferent, unshaken by what was about to happen. Reverend Jeff Hood sat with him, offering him prayers, discussing redemption. Was Nelson seeking forgiveness in his final moments, or was he simply resigned to his fate? He had long since accepted that Texas would not grant him clemency. There would be no last-minute intervention. Unlike some prisoners who order elaborate last meals, Nelson was given the standard prison tray. Texas had abolished custom last meal requests years earlier, after controversy surrounding previous high-profile executions. At 6 p.m., Nelson was led to the chamber. Witnesses, including the victim's family, spiritual advisors, and state officials, took their seats behind the glass. The process was methodical. Straps secured his arms. The 4 lines were inserted. The warden gave the signal. Nelson's final words rang through the room. "I'm not scared. I'm at peace. Let's ride, warden." At 6:12 p.m., the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, he was pronounced dead. Was justice served? His execution sparked debate. Some saw it as justice, others as another chapter in the cycle of state-sanctioned killing. Were there lingering questions about his guilt? Were there legal avenues left unexplored? And most importantly, did Stephen Lawayne Nelson take an untold truth with him to the grave? The answers remain elusive. I've expanded the outline with a detailed climax, covering Nelson's final hours, execution, and the lingering debates around justice. Let me know if you need refinements or want to proceed with the resolution and aftermath. The execution of Stephen Lawayne Nelson sent ripples through those who had followed his case for over a decade. For the family of Pastor Clint Dobson, it was a long-awaited moment, a necessary end to the nightmare that began on that tragic day in 2011. They did not speak to reporters after witnessing his final breath, choosing instead to retreat into their own quiet reflections. For Nelson's supporters, it was a moment of deep sorrow. They believed his case was mishandled, that his confession was coerced, that he was not the true killer. His spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, called the execution a failure of justice, stating that Nelson had found redemption in his final days. The public was divided. Some saw it as a just consequence for a brutal crime, others as a tragic reminder of flaws in the justice system. The media dissected every detail, his last meal, or lack thereof, his final words, the process of execution itself. It reignited debates on capital punishment in Texas, a state known for its high execution rate. Even in death, Stephen Lawayne Nelson left behind unresolved mysteries. Was his confession genuine, or was it a final attempt to control his own narrative? Did he truly feel remorse, or was it all a calculated act? What role did his past and upbringing play in shaping his fate? And the question that lingers the most, did Texas execute an innocent man? The execution of Nelson forces us to confront larger issues beyond his guilt or innocence. It forces a look into a system that is both unyielding and flawed, where the finality of death leaves no room for error. The moral and legal implications of capital punishment continue to be debated, but one thing remains certain: Stephen Lawayne Nelson's case will not be forgotten. The memory of Pastor Clint Dobson lives on in those who loved him, in the congregation he led, in the people he touched. And in the shadows of Texas death row, the legacy of Nelson's final confession remains, a story unfinished, an execution that will be questioned for years to come. Do you think the justice system got it right? Was Nelson's remorse genuine, or was he playing a final mind game? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true crime cases. Share this video with those interested in justice and true crime.